I got 3 alligators on the cat of democracy. Wait till it bites the tournament. Wait till it bites the go to liberty.
Oh.
Take an example. I shut. Very good. To scale. That's some PPD there. 4 alligators. Well done. Wow, you guys nailing this. Any more quizzes? 2 cloud quiz.
I started one.
I don't know, you know. These are, some are very well done, some are absolutely terrifying, which would be better. All right, so we're not going to get to the test on Friday. We could do the test today because you guys are, I mean, you guys are so, you know your stuff. What is the quiz? Oh.
Are we doing short ideas for the test?
Yes. I'm finishing up the test. I'm trying to decide how many short IDs you want to do. How many you want?
2.
We're on 32 now.
1 or 2. I say.
Math is so easy. You just put the numbers together.
1. Yeah.
I'm looking at 4. You're right. 5? 6? I mean, I'm here I like dealing. I like the give and take of bargaining. Huh?
I did bargain.
6? So we're at 6 now?
No.
7?
2. 3.
10? 13? Math is fun. I'm looking at 4. Okay, so with that, I will give you hints, but I'm not putting the asterisks on the review list anymore. And so let's go ahead and finish up. Let's get to Jackson. Andrew Jackson. But we're not quite to this one yet. We got to come back to Jackson. Because Jackson will be, and I got to say one more dual story. So we got to stop, right? Oh, we got to socialism. And by the way, who would be kind of, in many ways, the ideological, the ideological ideas of socialism, basically a critique of capitalism? Who would write the Communist Manifesto? Marx and Engels, but Marx is one we're going to get to here. And what kind of society did socialists want? Yeah, classless society. How they get there? Okay, that's up to debate. But that would be a critique or one of the reactions to capitalism. And what else? So we went through labor unions. So what is called where the union would negotiate a contract for all workers? Yeah, everybody remember that? That's collective bargaining. And that's something you should really know. Especially now that we have more strikes we've had in the United States at this very moment that we've had in 40 years. Workers, I think, have had enough of low wages and bad conditions. By the way, what are prices doing right now? Yeah, we have a little bit of inflation. The big thing is we're on a worldwide oil market, and there's demand for oil all over, and Russia and Saudi Arabia have cut back on production. And if you cut back on production and something in demand, what happens to prices? It goes up, and that's what's happening right now. So there's a worldwide shortage. We're stuck in the middle of that. Not a lot we could do. And then also rents are just skyrocketing. Rent is unbelievable. There's a little bit of increase in some food and things, but the big thing is rent and gas. Let's get back to this. Just to review. What was that kind of romantic idea of going back to nature, but it was very elitist in American history? What were they called? Who were they? Who? Well, it was a romantic idea. Say it again. Nativists, they were anti what? Yeah, native and anti-immigrant. Was that right? Yeah, transcendentalists. I think someone said it, I just didn't hear it. The transcendentalists. And, oh, what was the attempt at a labor union party that failed there because we're in a two-party system? No, definitely were anti-immigrant. I know all these start blending together. Had the great name, Loco Focos. And they would eventually decide, for the most part, wages. We'll get to both. And so let's start the Jacksonian era, which is another reaction to the Industrial Revolution. So we did I know the bell rang, but we did the thesis statement yesterday, right? We'll do more, and I'll try to get earlier in class. It just didn't work out yesterday, but that's the way life is. And so the Jacksonian era, another reaction. This is going to be the Jacksonian democracy. And Jackson's going to be one of the most polarizing characters in American history, partially because his opponents were so successful in painting an image of Jackson that is not quite true, even though he does deserve to be very controversial. In some ways, he was, I would argue, very good. In some ways, very bad. But he was the man of the horse, the leader, the common man, or, we'll come back to this cartoon, the tyrant. And Jackson would come into play in the king during this. Remember the era of good feelings, one political party. This was the election in 1920 where it was almost unanimous in electoral college. But it's also different in this way. Between 1820 and 1824, more states would allow voters to pick the electorate. It's what we have today. So things are changing dramatically. And Jackson doesn't deserve the credit for making the change, but he would personify this change. He represented and demanded. By the way, we'll come back to Missouri. Now, we already know about the new economy, so this is somewhat a review. We already know about the Industrial Revolution, the capitalism, the market revolution, the financial revolution, transportation revolution. Isn't this picture awesome? So it's the B&O Railroad. At the time of the B&O Railroad, it literally went to about halfway to Philadelphia. It made it to here. But look at the carriages. They're basically horse-drawn carriages with train wheels, and then they put the little umbrellas on top so people can ride it like a carnival ride. Okay, kind of precursor to the big changes coming up. But don't forget, the first ever financial panic of this new economic system would hit, and this was a shocking affair, where banks shut their doors and people lost money they thought they had. And then the growth of textiles. And what section of the country were the first textile mills? What section of the country? Hey, don't look what I'm pointing. It's clearly wrong. Do you remember? Here. Why in New England? What do they have there for the fuel source? Yeah, fast-moving streams because there's low mountains there. And what do textiles need? This is where we get to the key element here. What kind of fiber were they using to make the thread? Cotton all of a sudden came into great demand. All of a sudden, cotton. Now, the cotton was in demand before, but never like it was with the textile mills. Now we have the textile mills in Britain, but that'll be the first elements of the Industrial Revolution here. And who invented the cotton gin? Eli Whitney. Just at a time that they could produce more cotton per slave. It would rip off the hard seed. You have a hard cotton fluff. It would do the work. One slave could now do the work of 10 slaves with the cotton gin. So what all of a sudden became incredibly profitable? Slavery. And that's the key thing. Industrial Revolution, textiles, cotton, slavery. They thought slavery was going to go away. And it didn't. Do you remember the compromise they had where they said that the federal government could regulate commerce for 20 years? Regulate commerce, but what wouldn't they touch for 20 years? Yeah, they thought slavery, a better way to look at it is, they were hoping this horrific institution would just kind of go away. all of a sudden, it's potentially more profitable than ever before. More money can be made from this new economy. And that new economy, combined with slavery, hid all the insecurities. Back in 1808, the U.S. government banned the slave trade. So President Jefferson would sign a bill, Jefferson the slaveholder. And the basic idea was this: if you end the transatlantic slave trade, which everybody acknowledged was the most horrific thing imaginable, it was a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. We can't even wrap our mind around how horrific the transatlantic slave trade was. Here's from an anti-slavery journal. This is what we call an ultra-tight packing ship. Because they figured no matter how they were packed in, these human beings, 1/3 to 50% would die. So we're going to get as much money as possible. It's beyond belief how bad. And we'll come back to this. What they thought was, if you bring in fewer new slaves, eventually you have fewer slaveholders. And that would make slavery go away. The percentage of slaveholders and slaves would drop in states, and eventually, down the road, Jefferson had a name for this, and it was called diffusion. And the whole idea was this: if you spread slavery out, fewer slaves, kind of spread it out, so you have more states with slavery, spread it out, it will eventually go away. Now, long after Jefferson would be dead. So he's thinking, I'm not going to change my life, but down the road you will change. This really reminds me of climate change. Every time I mention this, I'm not going to change, you guys. Oh, you will change. But the political power of slaveholders will drop. If there's fewer of them, at least as a percentage of the population, there'll be less opposition to get rid of slaves. And that's what seemed to be happening in the early part of the 19th century up here. These states started to get rid of the slave codes and get rid of slavery. It was complex getting rid of slavery because slaves are property, but they were getting rid of them. And so that's what they thought. And so Jefferson's thinking, ban the slave trade, kind of spread it out, fewer slaves, the percentage dropped down because it's not going to happen in places like New York, slavery will go away. And then the old Industrial Revolution hit, and thus I put the asterisk in the weird shape of this font, and everything changed. All of a sudden, no wait, we want slaves. We don't want fewer slave states. We don't want this number to go down. And so they start to ask a different question. What if slavery was restricted? What if we have fewer slave states? What if these states in the Louisiana Purchase want to become, or one of these areas of Louisiana Purchase want to become states? What's going to happen? What if there's no more new slave states? Even if you don't, you're a restricted number of slaves coming in, aka kidnapped people coming into the United States, what will happen? Well, they looked at it differently. All of a sudden, we're making money, slavery is working, we don't want it to go away. What will happen if there's fewer slave states? Let's say these states with a lower population percentage of slaves get rid of it. That means slaves will concentrate here, which is kind of what happened. By the way, they had a name for this, really dark, rich soil, cotton production. They called it the Black Belt, or downriver. What if there's a greater and greater percentage of slaves in a smaller area? What does that increase the threat of? And that's what they said. If we don't have more slave states, you're threatening us with slave rebellion. So originally, diffusion was to get rid of slaves. It turned into a way to keep this profitable thing going. Why? We want more slave states to protect slavery. So South Carolina is saying, we want slave states west of the Mississippi River. Why? To protect slavery in South Carolina. If you don't allow slavery in places like, let me throw an example out. Missouri. Then you're condemning us here to the hells of slave rebellion. But they're also saying, just when we're starting to really make a lot of money off of working these people to death. So they don't want to talk about that as much, but they're condemning us to slave rebellion. And what island was there a slave rebellion? Haiti. They all know. So I wonder if this is going to blow up in the middle of the era of good feelings. This controversy will become known as the Missouri Compromise. And it was massive. It would almost become like a religious compromise down the road. Like, we got to go back to the Missouri Compromise. But it really showed the issue of sectionalism. And when I mean this, more and more the different views of northern, aka free states, and slave states. So Missouri, right here. St. Louis is already a relatively big town, but along the Missouri River, a number of plantations started. People forced their slaves into here, and they wanted to become a state with slave codes, aka a slave state. And these states, when they came in, it wasn't that controversial. But remember, these states, it's already been decided would have no slavery. There'd been no decision about here. What is the ordinance that said these would be free states? Do you remember? Say it again. Yeah, the Northwest Ordinance. Do you remember that? The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. There wasn't a big complaint. And Louisiana, there are already so many people here with slaves and sugar plantations here. That wasn't controversial. So a lot of Southerners were taken by surprise when Northerners were furious. They didn't want another slave state. Kind of blew them away. We don't want another slave state. And at the time, there was an exact equal number of states without slave codes, free states, and slaves with them, slave states. Exact equal number. Well, a Congressman, James Talmadge, from New York, proposed an amendment to the bill allowing Missouri in as a state. And Talmadge was a Republican. They're all Republicans. But he was tired of slave power. What compromise behind the article? What compromise in the Constitution was the whole issue of slave power? Yeah, remember the 3/5 compromise? And so he said, we're tired of having more members of Congress and more, what picks the president again? Electors for, and they were quite open about this, for white person. Why should white voters in the South have more votes per white person than white voters in the North? Because whites are overrepresented in the South because they're counting slaves at 3/5 of a person. I don't know, the horrors of that statement is awful. It's just horrible. But that's what he said. We're tired of this. We're tired of being dominated by a few slaveholders overrepresented in Congress. So his plan was, okay, we'll allow Missouri in with slaves, but we'll do what New York did. It's called post-Navy emancipation. Anybody know what okay, you know what emancipation means? Well, that's a term that emancipation can be used. But the broader term is there's a broader term that deals with slaves. You're free. So you're free from your parents. Slaves are free. Emancipation means free. So that was another way to use emancipation. So you're free from their control. Emancipation means free. You might know what post-Navy means. After what? Good guess. Have you heard of prenatal care? So what do you think post-Navy means? After birth. So slaves will become free when they reach a certain age after they're born. They did it in New York for 19 to 21-year-olds. That's how they got rid of slavery. New York did it, so they say when women turn 19 and men turn 21, they will be free. So it'll be slaves up to that time. So what did Talmadge propose? Any slave born after Missouri becomes a state will become free at 25. They'll be emancipated. They'll become free. Who is this meant to help? What group of people? And well, New York did it, and then in Missouri. Huh? A little bit. It is kind of meant to help a white republic. You're on the right track. But even more definite help to one particular small group of people. Actually, it would help them a lot. Actually, you're right. Because it was meant to help the slave owners. And we'll get to how the slave traders, because you're right, actually. It's meant to help the slave traders, the holders. What about the slaveholders that all this wealth in slavery, and now we're going to take that away? This was a way to compensate slaveholders, and yes, it would help the slave traders. How would it compensate slaveholders? Because slaves will get their freedom. Now, one, you might say, what are we going to say? Won't they work until they're 25, until they'll get that work out of them? And could they have children before then? So the children would be what? Until they turn 25. But there's another even more sinister way. Does anyone know? They're slaves until the day before they turn 25. They're property. And what can you do with property? Sell them to a slave state. Thus being hauled by slave traders. And so what they would do is, and the term they would say is, you're going downriver to the new cotton plantation state. And so they would tell slaves, work hard, don't run away, and you'll get your freedom. And then what would they do? Just before they're free, sell them into permanent slavery in Alabama or Mississippi. Isn't this just horrific? And they would get their money. And yes, if they had any kids, they keep the kids. They broke up families all the time, right? Isn't this just awful? Why did Talmadge want this? Well, Talmadge is saying, we want a white republic. So we don't want to deal with former slaves who are not white. Yeah, yes, this is anti-slavery, but it's certainly not pro-equality. So keep a white republic. Thus, get rid of 3/5 compromise. So, the thought was, who could complain? The slaveholders were compensated. Sure, you might lose a little bit of power, but what the heck? And they're 25. That's fairly old. What was the Southern reaction to this? If you pass this law, that means civil war. And they didn't do the, hey, let's talk and debate this. No, they threw the bomb right away. The Union is over if this is passed. Which is kind of a big reaction, huh? Why? All right, so you get rid of the slaves here if you have a low slave percentage, right? And it's go downriver. Maryland has a pretty low percentage of slaves. Post-Canadian emancipation, downriver. Delaware, downriver. Virginia has the most slaves in the country, but the tobacco plantations aren't making as much money. They even talk about post-Canadian emancipation there in the 1830s. Downriver. Kentucky, downriver. What happens to the percentage of slaves here? And you're condemning them to? And so this was a way to trap them into slave rebellion. And here's the other thing. If all of these become free states, what body of Congress has equal representation for states? In the Senate. And southern states will be overwhelmed. The House is decided by population. What's happening to the population already between North and South? Where are most of the new immigrants going? They can do the math. If we allow Missouri to come in with post-Canadian emancipation, that implies all the rest here, no slave code. Slave rebellion, and eventually they might get rid of slavery. This is a direct attack on our way of life. We will blow the whole thing up unless you allow for senatorial balance, meaning we're going to bring Missouri in as a slave state. We have to keep the people balanced between slave states and free states, or it's civil war. By the way, can you imagine how Northerners reacted? They were furious. There are a bunch of bullies down in the South who cry and whine because they want to keep slavery. Eventually, the North in the United States is going to say enough. It just won't be until 1861. They'll finally know we're not going to be bullied by you people anymore. But Civil War was on the edge, especially when this passed the House. And it just, you can imagine like, war. And this is the era of good feeling, remember? We all love each other. So with that, the Missouri Compromise came about. And what happened was this, Senator H.E. Thompson of Illinois, we don't need to know him, came up with two ideas. It's not a great compromise, but the compromise is this. Missouri will be a slave state, and we'll break off a hunk of Massachusetts and call it Maine, and make that a free state. Senatorial balance. But then what about all the rest of this territory? Of the Louisiana Purchase? They decided all territory north of 3630, this latitude line right here, meaning all of this, no slavery. By the way, the term for no slavery in the territories will soon be called free soil. And we will get to that. Free soil. It's a weird word. But no slavery in the Louisiana Purchase. So that means only Arkansas territory, this is complex here, would be slave states. Southerners didn't like this, but they also know laws can be overturned. And Spain's weak, as it turns out, really weak. Mexico would win its independence the next year. And so, with that, somewhat of a compromise, except it didn't pass. Northerners hated this. Southerners hated this. But Henry Clay, who would be dubbed the Great Compromiser after this, had the bill split in the Senate, and individually the two sections passed. The one about the states passed in the South. 3630 passed in the North. And do not forget this, because it's really easy to do. 3630 here, this latitude line only applies here. It has no effect over here. These already have governments. But 3630 will have almost like a biblical reference. Like if we could somehow just go back to the 3630 line. Clay, this in many ways would make him, he thought it would make him president in 1824. It did not. Clay would not become president. He tried 5 times. 3 times really close. So, while this is going on, let's get to Andrew Jackson. Okay, you don't need to write down, just write Andrew Jackson was emerging from the political scene, because one thing I do want you to know about Jackson. He came from about as humble a background as possible. Unlike virtually every other president, he was not an aristocrat. He did not inherit wealth. He's also, look at the date. So you don't need to write all this down, just kind of a background material. He's the last president who was not born an American citizen. He was a citizen of what country in 1767? What country was he a citizen of? (1767). When did the United States win its independence? What country was the United States part of, or the colonies part of? He was a citizen of Britain. He became a citizen of the United States when the United States became a country. Wasn't yet a country. Now, in the Constitution, all presidents born after the writing of the Constitution must be born in the United States or in the United States territory. Like if a president is born, like their father was an ambassador to Spain, and they're born in Madrid. If they're born there, that's considered still American territory because they're born citizens. But let's get back to this. He was orphaned at 13. He literally had nothing. He would fight in the Revolutionary War as a little kid. He was a message runner. He was captured by the British and was forced to submit. Andrew Jackson would not submit to an officer. This is going to be a famous picture of him. He would not submit and kneel. And so he would threaten him with his sword and eventually do the two little cuts out of his cheek. But Jackson took it. You can imagine how this kind of made Jackson's reputation. He will not back down. And his hatred of the British would only be matched by his hatred of wealthy people. Wealthy people who inherited the wealth, the aristocracy. He hated George Washington and called him arista for aristocrats. He hated inherited wealth. He thought the way the United States would be is that everybody, regardless of where they're born, should have the same access to wealth or success. But back to this. In 1801, he would move to Nashville. He did acquire some land, have a big slave labor camp. He was a plantation owner. He would also be a lawyer, self-taught, very intelligent man, well-spoken, very articulate, incredibly loyal, nice, urbane. His opponents would give him this reputation as being this rough-hewn Westerner with a volcanic temper and cruel, all these things that people still say today. No, he wasn't. Let me rephrase that. He had a volcanic temper. He had a temper. But other than that, he had 4 bullets in his body by age 30. Give him a break. He was a lawyer. By the way, what made you a lawyer in 1800? I'm a lawyer! Yes, you had to do more than that, but there was no professional requirements to the end of that century. And in Nashville, he developed quite a reputation. He would marry a divorcee, which, by the way, especially for women, being divorced was quite controversial. That must mean there's something wrong with you. You must be somehow immoral. Not so much men, but women. And a man by the name of Charles Dickinson, who was a rival of Jackson anyways, basically called her a bigamist for being a divorce and a prostitute, because she had worked in a tavern for a while. You serve in a tavern? Must be. It's pretty horrific. Jackson, who adored his wife Rachel, was furious and challenged him to a duel. Jackson would fight over 100 duels. Do you remember I told you about the Burr-Hamilton duel? And they did the whole thing about keeping it secret and all that. No, they fought right in the streets of Nashville. There was an audience of a few hundred people watching these duels. And Jackson would fight and would never back down. In fact, Jackson, when they would line up 20 paces, and when they would start the duel, this one would be started with a 1, 2, 3, and then step back. Person in the middle, a judge. Jackson would just sit there and glare at the other person and let them shoot first. And he would decide what to do. He could shoot in the air or not. And so when Jackson challenged Dickinson to a duel, Dickinson, who was furious, agreed to fight. And Dickinson knew what Jackson was going to do. And so when they lined up at 20 paces, and they're all facing this way, and they're kind of like this, they dropped it. Jackson just sat there and glared. Dickinson took very careful aim and hit him right here. It destroyed at least 5 ribs. Now you might say, how could a bullet get that many? This is black powder. The musket balls move really slow, and at a slight angle, it could rip it apart. What it did when it would hit it, it wouldn't go through a bone. It would spread them out and splinter them into bits inside of you. That's why the threat of infection was so bad when a bone was nicked, even more than today. That's why if you got hit here and the bone was nicked, what did they have to do immediately? Cut it off. Maybe I'll take a day and tell you how to cut the arms off. Wouldn't that be a fun day? Before we have a good lunch. Okay, so through his lungs, which of course collapsed it, which I guess a collapsed lung, the pain is exquisite. That first breath, you never forget. I broke a rib, and I know how bad it is to breathe with a broken rib. Breathing's okay without it. And in fact, I recommend it. But we'll go through and then would lodge a 1/4 inch from his heart. Now, To most people, that would probably slow them down. To people like us, me and Jackson, we didn't stop. Supposedly, Jackson just kind of shook and glared again. Blood just started spewing out and puddling at his feet. And he just, in fact, not only that, he took very careful aim and click. Didn't fire, but he recocked and didn't care and shot again. Hit him right there. And then Jackson walked 2 blocks to the nearest doctor's office. Don't mess with Andrew Jackson. If Andrew Jackson walked through this door, okay, he died in 1845, so that'd be pretty scary and amazing, but he'd have that bullet here for the rest of his life. He later on said, even if he would have hit me in the brain, I would have dropped him. And I kind of believe it. And so, that's Andrew Jackson. Now, you can imagine the story about his dueling and fighting, and there were some temper issues, but he had a bullet here, and a bullet down here. This would start to fester all the time, and so he'd have it removed when he was president. And they basically gave him a shot of whiskey, put it on a piece of leather, and gouged it out. We were tough back then. You notice I'm including myself in this? Yeah. So now, let's get back. So we got Horseshoe Bend, right? Remember that one against the Creeks? And then the big battle of New Orleans? And then the first Seminole War where they invaded. Now, who was going to Florida? Who was running away to Florida and they wanted to cut off that? Yeah, this whole thing about slavery is so intertwined. And even get the nickname Old Hickory, because a hickory switch, a couple reasons. First off, hickory switch are really tough. You can bend it, but it snaps right back. They might be thin, but they're tough. But that's also used to beat. And he represented common man. Now, I mean common, I don't mean like average. What I mean by common is somebody not born of aristocratic birth, a common. And he so hated aristocrats. That's why I find it so funny that President Trump claimed to like Andrew Jackson. I don't think he knew much about him. And Andrew Jackson hated people who inherited their wealth. And that's how Andrew Jackson, President Trump would have no money at all after inheritance. And it's kind of amazing to me. But it also knows that most people have no idea. And so he seemed tough, so I'll be tough. History has some interesting things that what people don't really know. And I like this picture of the duel. 3 feet apart. That's why he didn't miss. So, the big argument against him was class, though. The elite would claim that he was lower class. And this is what happens when you elect commoners. By the way, this elite argument is used over and over again. It's very much a double-edged sword. And let me give you a quote what Thomas Jefferson said. Pushing this idea that he was somehow irrational. He was not irrational. Yes, he had a volcanic temper. Yes, he made mistakes. But this was all played because this is the kind of people who are poor, working people, not the elite like Jefferson. And remember Jefferson? What was his goal? His philosophy was to represent what kind of people? What did he say? He represented the common man? But he was more like, you guys pick me. Don't pick one of you. So, we're coming to the election of 1824. Henry Clay. Now, there's only one party. So 5 people said they wanted to be president. 5. Henry Clay, the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams. Doesn't he look like a sinister? Well, we'll get back to that. William Crawford of Georgia actually looked like he was going places. But right before the election, he had a stroke. And they're all from different sections: Kentucky, Massachusetts, Georgia, and then, of course, Andrew Jackson, who was immensely popular. Member of the Senate. He had been in the Senate. War hero, yes. Crawford. And we'll come back to this. And also one more guy. We'll come back to it. Have a great day, everybody. Right when you find work, and keep punching waterfalls. I'm not sure what that is. Still sticking with the Vikings, huh? See you tomorrow. It'll take 5 minutes. Good to see you tomorrow. I might have an answer. Yeah.
Why did injection
Huh?
Why did injection
You know, there's lots of reasons why, but they're political rivals. There was an issue about a legal matter dealing with land, and then but the big thing is Dickinson had his haircut, was inherited well, and he saw this, you know, Jackson nothing coming, you know. Exactly. And then when Jackson married a divorcee, oh, that's how common. Yeah, that class thing, and it still goes today. It's kind of a double-edged sword, but yeah. And I like it when elitists we use it as too. See you tomorrow. I forgot my frisbee. Dude, I gotta throw that down into your shirt. By the way, Garfield, who, pray tell, would like a quiz today? I can see from your eyes, it's almost unanimous. It's quiz day. Half sheet of paper, number it 1, 2, give me a number. 82, 822. All right, numbered 1 to 822. No, it's not. It's meant to fight and brawl. And people who are not in that short don't know. Actually, huh? Do you want to do this thing? Are you doing?
I felt so stupid walking down the stairs, and I literally like walking like. Okay, wait, no, watch this. I cannot get down the freaking verses ones. I'm mixing up so bad. No, dude, I just got it down to one-word sentences. So, Dartmouth contract. It's charters, right? Charters? It's just contract. So it comes out of your mouth. When you say contract out of your mouth, it can be Maryland, marry you. You have taxes on marriages, right to tax the bank. They don't. Dude, that's what it was. They don't. Dude, I thought it was interstate commerce. Yes, interstate is given. No, that's given. Given is interstate. No, because when you give someone, they interact with someone. Given.
All right, we're only going to do 10 questions. 1 to 10.
Then the amount.
No.
And then the
So I got down to one sentence is pretty.
That's actually the best way to do it.
Yeah.
The more you can condense it, the more it sticks in your memory.
Dude, it works.
Dude!
Right.
If I'm wearing a cowboy hat in the chat.
Well, you're wearing like a brown belt and brown
Good point,
shoes.
brown belt.
Dude, and Mr. Ward this morning too. You're like, dude, it is. Dude, I actually.
A dude is a fake cowboy. Somebody, a city slicker goes out to the country.
When you
That ain't me.
get into the habit of saying it, it just sticks with you. And then dinosaur cowboy. I call it senior range. I thought that's what a dinosaur.
A dinosaur cowboy would be somebody who actually has
Okay,
probably in the city.
Uh-huh.
A dude would be somebody who lives in the city and
Yeah.
they go to the country. And they turn them forward. They actually call these guys dudes, right? People act like a cowboy. And that was a big thing at the turn of the last century. Yeah, that's where the name comes from. And so the real, your people who actually get out and do that hard job would mock them as well too. But dinosaur cowboy is another good one. That's true, too. And that's kind of a 1930s thing.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of them here at Capital.
Dinosaur?
Yeah, you know, they're dressed in cowboy boots and stuff, and they've never been, you know,
Yeah.
which is
Oh, I
perfectly
know,
fine.
like, I had a cowboy boot.
There's nothing wrong with it. I think.
How do we know about ATM at 20?
Cowboy boots are really hard to break in. That's why I do
Taxes
that.
on European goods, right?
Jack, on
And
impulse.
and it was very good for the east, but not as good for the south.
Yeah. Where the where's the
See, I don't know. So what's the difference?
Did you try to run me over? Let's get started.
Well, I tried to avoid the argument an hour. I'm giving you something to say. How should I say it? Commerce, interface, and commerce, and Maryland, delight and
Does that make sense?
yeah. Maryland,
I want, you know, this is
commerce, Dartmouth. Don't say Dartmouth and commerce.
half sheet of paper, 1 to 10. Everybody's name is Dude.
I'm an engineer. I've never used up that one. I'm always done with my notebook. I literally grabbed a really thick one. What is the station that you grab?
Shall we quiz? Dude.
What about bro? Origin of the word bro.
Huh?
What's the origin of the word bro?
That one I'm not sure. I mean, I bet it has something to do with sister.
Oh. So that means when I call you sister, because like bro,
The bros, brothers, like your sister.
But then it'd be like,
Confusing.
it did honestly. Oh my god. Because I don't want to
Dude. Thank you. Thank you. And we will have a drawing. The I tell you what, the pictures have been fantastic.
I'm nervous.
Were you nervous about the picture?
Gibbons commerce, right?
Please, everyone do well in this.
What happened? They won. And they all got college scholarships. Yeah. And then we went to something called Fair Park. I went to Logan, I'm not in They all got college
Then we got a
scholarships.
college scholarship. That's awesome.
And we Christian went to college, got a degree.
All right, here we go.
Um,
Quiz. You go on. I'm motivated. Huh? Pronunciation. Oh, we're still filming this.